What if I told you there are cities so terrible that people were forced to live there? Cities where the air is poison, the ground is toxic, and leaving is almost impossible. These aren't horror movie sets. They're real places where real people still live today. Welcome to the story of the Soviet Union's darkest cities. The beginning of a nightmare. Let me take you back to the 1920s. Russia had a big problem. While America and Europe had factories, cars, and modern cities, Russia was still stuck in the past. Most people were farmers using old tools. The new Soviet government looked at this and panicked. Their leader, Joseph Stalin, made a bold promise. He said Russia would catch up with the West in just 5 years. 5 years. To do this, they needed to build massive factories and entirely new cities from scratch. But here's the catch. They built these cities in the worst possible places. Why? Because that's where they found valuable metals and minerals underground. They didn't care if people would be happy there. They only cared about getting those resources out of the ground as fast as possible. Magnitogorsk, the city that shouldn't exist. Let's start with Magnitogorsk. This city was built in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty land. The Soviets chose this spot because they found huge amounts of iron underground. So much iron that compasses stopped working properly nearby. Think about moving to a place where there's literally nothing. No houses, no shops, no roads, just empty land. That's what the first workers found when they arrived. The first years were horrible. The first people who came to build Magnitogorsk didn't even get real houses. They lived in old train cars. Imagine living in a metal box during freezing Russian winters. Even the bosses sent their hate at it. One wrote that being sent to Magnitogorsk felt like a personal tragedy. Why was it so bad? Well, there was no entertainment, no culture, nothing to do after work. The streets were so dangerous that women were scared to go outside at night. The local newspaper reported axe murders, shootings, and robberies happening regularly. Most workers stayed for only 82 days and then left. That's less than 3 months. But many people couldn't leave even if they wanted to. 3 out of every 10 workers were forced to be there. The government had taken them from their homes and families and made them work in this horrible place. A city built wrong. The planners made terrible mistakes from the very beginning. They wanted to build homes on one side of a lake and put the factories on the other side. This would keep the pollution away from where people lived. But there was a problem. Building a bridge was too expensive. So what did they do? They just put everything together on the same side. Homes, factories, everything mixed up. But it gets worse. They made a surveying error. This means they measured wrong when planning the city. Because of this mistake, they built the homes downwind from the factories. Do you know what downwind means? It means the wind blows from the factories toward the homes. So every day, thick smoke and poisonous chemicals blew right into people's houses. The residents had to breathe factory pollution all day and all night. The broken promises. The Soviet government had big dreams for Magnitogorsk. They wanted to build a workers' paradise. They promised modern water systems, sewage, libraries, clubs, and beautiful buildings. But 8 years after the city was founded, it still had open sewage trenches. That means human waste flowing in open ditches through the streets. There wasn't even a proper hospital. Diseases spread quickly: malaria, scarlet fever, typhus. People got sick all the time because the water was polluted and the sewage mixed with the drinking water. Why did this happen? The Soviet government was in such a hurry to build factories that they forgot about the people. One historian said it perfectly. Magnitogorsk was just a factory with a city attached to it, not a city with a factory. The legacy of pollution. Even today, almost 100 years later, Magnitogorsk is still one of the most polluted cities on Earth. The soil contains arsenic, a poison so deadly it's been used as a weapon. There's 21 times more arsenic in the ground than is safe for humans. In 2012, Magnitogorsk ranked 3rd in the entire world for carbon monoxide pollution. In 2015, it was the 3rd most polluted city in Russia. Local doctors reported something shocking. Only 1% of babies born in the city were completely healthy. Lung cancer rates became so high that hospitals couldn't handle all the patients. Why didn't they fix these problems? A factory manager explained it simply in 1989. With our equipment, you either stop making products or you destroy the air. We have plans to meet and bonuses to earn. That's why we keep polluting. Fixing it would take too long and cost too much money. In other words, making money was more important than people's health. Even people's lives. Norilsk, the frozen prison city. If you think Magnitogorsk sounds bad, wait until you hear about Norilsk. This city is even worse. It's located way up north in Siberia, one of the coldest places humans have ever tried to live. A city built by prisoners. Between 1935 and 1956, Norilsk started as a prison camp called a gulag. Over 275,000 prisoners passed through this camp. These weren't just criminals. Many were normal people who disagreed with the government or were accused of being enemies of the state. The winter temperature here averages negative 30 degrees Celsius. That's negative 22 Fahrenheit. Even in summer, it only gets to about 10 degrees Celsius, 50 Fahrenheit. For a month and a half every winter, the sun doesn't come up at all. Imagine living in total darkness for 6 weeks. Doctors at the prison hospital noticed something disturbing. Many prisoners developed mental illnesses just from living in such a dark, cold, isolated place. When a New York Times reporter visited in 1936, he wrote, "This place is so isolated, it might as well be on another planet. Why build a city here? So why would anyone build a city in such a terrible place?" The answer is simple: valuable metals. Norilsk sits on top of huge deposits of nickel, copper, cobalt, and platinum. These metals are worth billions of dollars, and they're needed for making weapons, electronics, and nuclear power plants. The Soviet government was desperate to get these metals out of the ground, so they forced prisoners to do the mining work. If you worked hard as a prisoner in Norilsk, you had a better chance of surviving than in other prison camps. Not because they cared about you, but because they needed healthy workers to keep mining. By 1953, Norilsk produced 35% of all Soviet nickel, 12% of its copper, 30% of its cobalt, and 90% of its platinum. It was too valuable to shut down. From prison camp to city. In 1956, the prison camp was closed. But there were already thousands of workers there, along with all the mining equipment and factories. The Soviet government decided it would be wasteful to abandon everything. So they turned the prison camp into a regular city. The freed prisoners were given apartments to live in. But these weren't nice apartments. They were concrete towers built to survive the extreme cold. Today, if you visit Norilsk, all you see are gray concrete buildings as far as the eye can see. It looks like a concrete jungle in the frozen north. A new problem: climate change. Now these buildings face a new danger. The ground in Norilsk is normally frozen solid all year round. It's called permafrost. But climate change is making the earth warmer, so the permafrost is melting. When the frozen ground melts, it becomes soft and muddy. The heavy concrete buildings are starting to sink into the soft ground. In May 2020, this caused a disaster. A huge fuel storage tank collapsed because the ground underneath it melted. About 21,000 tons of diesel fuel spilled into the soil and rivers. This was one of the worst environmental disasters in Arctic history. The fuel poisoned the land and water, making an already polluted city even more toxic. Living in Norilsk today. Today, Norilsk is one of the 10 most polluted cities in the world. The air is filled with sulfur dioxide from the factories. This chemical burns your lungs and makes it hard to breathe. People who live in Norilsk die 10 years younger than other Russians on average. Cancer rates are extremely high. Respiratory diseases, problems with breathing, are everywhere. One Canadian visitor in 1971 said, "You can hardly breathe there. The open pit mining is ugly. We would never let this happen in our country." But mining continues. The main company in town, Nornickel, is still expanding. They're digging more mines and building more factories. Why? Because the world still needs these metals and Norilsk has them. The residents feel powerless. They know the pollution is killing them, but what can they do? The mining company provides almost all the jobs. If you speak out against pollution, you might lose your job. And if you lose your job in Norilsk, how will you afford to leave? The bizarre addition. In 2021, something strange happened. A Bitcoin mining company moved to Norilsk to use the cheap electricity. So now, in addition to all the metal mining, there are computers mining digital currency. But this doesn't help the residents. It's just another industry using their city's resources while contributing to the pollution. Imagine living in Norilsk in winter. It's dark almost all day. The air burns your lungs with every breath. The water might be contaminated with diesel fuel. You're surrounded by gray concrete towers slowly sinking into the melting ground. You want to leave, but you can't afford to. You walk home from your job at the nickel factory in the bitter cold. The only light you see is the glow from a Bitcoin sign, framed by factory smokestacks pumping poison into the air. You might think you're having a nightmare. But no, this is real life for thousands of people. We'll explore Vorkuta, a city that's somehow even worse than Norilsk. A city that's not just dying, it's already dead, but people are still trapped there. The story gets darker from here. If you thought Norilsk was the worst, let me tell you about Vorkuta. This city combines all the horrors of the previous cities with something even more terrifying. It's slowly dying, and the people trapped there know it. The same terrible beginning. Like Norilsk, Vorkuta started as a prison camp. It sits at almost the same latitude up north, meaning it's just as cold and dark. The winters are brutal, and the sun disappears for weeks at a time. But instead of mining metals, Vorkuta was built to mine coal. For decades, prisoners dug coal out of the frozen ground, while the Soviet government used that coal to power their industries. After the prison camp closed, a city grew around the coal mines, just like what happened in Norilsk. But here's where Vorkuta's story becomes truly tragic. When the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. Russia became a new country with a new economic system. The government looked at all the coal mines in Vorkuta and asked a simple question. Are these mines making money? The answer was no. The coal in Vorkuta was expensive to dig up because of the extreme location. The government could buy cheaper coal from other places. So they made a decision. They would close down the unprofitable mines. Between the early 1990s and 2009, more than half of Vorkuta's coal mines shut down. Thousands of people lost their jobs almost overnight. The cruel trap. This is what makes Vorkuta the most depressing city of all. At least in Magnitogorsk and Norilsk, people suffer for a reason. They get paid higher wages because the work is so hard. They have stable jobs. They can tell themselves, yes, this is terrible, but at least I'm earning money. At least I'm building something. In Vorkuta, you get all the suffering with almost none of the benefits. You still live in the freezing cold. You still live in the darkness. You still breathe polluted air. You still live in a concrete wasteland. But now you might not even have a job. Imagine that. You're stuck in one of the worst places on Earth, and you can't even earn enough money to leave. The great escape that never happened. After the Soviet Union collapsed, people started leaving Vorkuta as fast as they could. But there was a problem. Most people couldn't afford to leave. A historian named Alan Barenberg explained it this way. Moving your family and possessions by train became very expensive. Plus, Russia experienced something called hyperinflation in the 1990s. This means money became almost worthless very quickly. People's savings accounts that might have had enough money to move became empty almost overnight. So here's the tragedy. The economy was so bad that people wanted to leave desperately. But that same bad economy made it impossible for poor people to afford to leave. Only the wealthy could escape. The poor were trapped. To leave Vorkuta, you needed money. But to get money, you needed a job. And there were no jobs in Vorkuta because the mines were closing. It was a circle of hopelessness with no way out. The rise of crime and chaos. When legitimate businesses close down and people become desperate, crime fills the vacuum. That's exactly what happened in Vorkuta. The gangs take over. In the new privatized economy, people with money and connections quickly took control. They formed gangs and cartels. These criminal organizations started controlling all the imports and exports in the city. If you wanted to run a business, you had to pay protection money to the gangs. Without proper jobs or hope, people turned to drugs to escape their reality. Despite how isolated Vorkuta is, which should make drugs rare and expensive, 30% of people reported using drugs in 2007. For comparison, cities in southern Russia with known drug problems only averaged 18%. Why were drugs so popular in Vorkuta? Because the city had nothing else to offer. Remember, Vorkuta was built around industry. It was a monotown, a city with only one purpose. There were barely any social activities, cultural centers, or entertainment options. People were bored, isolated, and hopeless. So they turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of their existence. The population disappears. The statistics are shocking. Between 1989 and 2002, Vorkuta lost 26.6% of its population. That's 31,000 people who managed to escape. For comparison, Norilsk lost 23% but later recovered when the economy improved. Magnitogorsk only lost 5% because it always had work available. Vorkuta never recovered. The population kept falling year after year. A small hope that didn't help much. In 2003, something happened that prevented complete collapse. A private company bought Vorkuta's remaining coal mines and invested money into them. This stopped the economic freefall and saved some jobs. But it wasn't enough. Automation started replacing human workers. Machines could do the work of 10 men. More people lost their jobs. The population continued to shrink. The Russian government realized they had a serious problem. In 2003, they asked the World Bank for an $80 million loan. What was this money for? To help people leave Vorkuta. Think about how bad a situation has to be for the government to spend millions of dollars helping people abandon a city. And where would people go? Many moved to Norilsk. Yes, that same Norilsk we talked about earlier. The polluted, freezing city where people die 10 years younger than average. When Norilsk is considered an upgrade, something has gone terribly wrong. Living on borrowed time. Here's the darkest part of Vorkuta's story. Everyone knows the city is dying. It's not a question of if, but when. Coal is being phased out all over the world. Countries are moving to cleaner energy sources like solar and wind power. Coal is becoming less valuable every year. And coal is Vorkuta's heart. It's the only reason the city exists. One day soon, the last coal mine will close. The last jobs will disappear. And the people still living there will realize that their entire city was built on borrowed time. A historian described it perfectly. Living in Vorkuta is like being an atom living on a dying cell. The cell doesn't know it's dying yet, but it is, and nothing can stop it. The bigger picture. Why these cities exist. Now that we've explored all 3 cities, let's step back and ask the bigger question. Why did this happen? How did these nightmare cities come to exist? The Soviet philosophy. The Soviet Union was obsessed with catching up to the West. For centuries, Russia had been seen as backward and poor compared to countries like America, Britain, and Germany. Soviet leaders felt humiliated by this. When Stalin took power in the late 1920s, he made industrialization the top priority. He didn't just want Russia to catch up. He wanted it to surpass Western nations. And he wanted to do it fast. So the Soviets created the 5-year plan. The goal was to double or even triple industrial production in just 5 years. To do this, they needed to build entirely new industrial centers from scratch. But here's the key mistake. The Soviet government cared more about production numbers than human beings. They cared more about tons of steel and coal than the health and happiness of their workers. The terrible logic. There was a cold logic to their decisions. They placed cities in remote locations for 2 reasons. First, that's where the natural resources were. You can't mine iron where there is no iron, so Magnitogorsk had to be built near the iron deposits. Second, remote locations were safer in case of war. If enemies attacked, they couldn't easily reach factories that were thousands of miles from the border. But they never stopped to ask, should we build cities in places where humans aren't meant to live? Is it right to force people to live in these conditions? The answer was always, the needs of the state come first. Individual suffering doesn't matter if it helps the Soviet Union become powerful. The lasting damage. These cities represent the ultimate failure of putting industrial production above human welfare. They show what happens when governments treat people like machines instead of human beings with feelings, needs, and rights. The pollution in these cities won't go away for generations. The arsenic in Magnitogorsk soil will remain toxic for centuries. The cancer rates will stay high. The damaged lungs, the poisoned water, the psychological trauma. These effects will last for decades, maybe forever. And the worst part, most of these cities continue operating the same way today. The factories are still running. The pollution continues. People are still suffering. Because shutting everything down would be too expensive. And the world still needs the resources these cities produce. The people who stay. Not everyone in these cities is trapped against their will. Some people choose to stay. Why? It's home. For many residents, these cities are the only homes they've ever known. Their parents lived there, their grandparents lived there. All their memories are there. Even if the city is terrible, it's their terrible city. Humans are surprisingly adaptable. We can get used to almost anything if we're there long enough. People in Magnitogorsk don't think about the pollution every day. It's just normal life to them. People in Norilsk don't constantly complain about the darkness. It's just winter. Economic reality. Others stay because, despite everything, they still have jobs. A job in a nightmare city is better than no job in a better place. The wages in these industrial cities are often higher than in other parts of Russia because companies need to convince people to work there. Some people calculate that they can work in these cities for 10 to 20 years, save money, and then retire somewhere better. It's a gamble with their health, but for some, it's their only path to financial security. Nowhere else to go. And sadly, many people simply have nowhere else to go. Moving to a big city like Moscow or St. Petersburg is expensive. Those cities don't have enough jobs or housing for everyone. At least in places like Norilsk, you can find work at the mining company. Lessons for today. What can we learn from these Soviet cities? Lesson 1. Short-term thinking leads to long-term disasters. The Soviets were in such a hurry to industrialize that they made terrible decisions. They saved money by not building proper sewage systems, by mixing residential and industrial zones, by ignoring safety and health concerns. Those savings cost billions in damage and countless lives over the decades that followed. Lesson 2. You can't sacrifice human welfare for economic growth forever. For a while, the Soviet Union got what it wanted, rapid industrialization. But at what cost? Entire generations of people suffered. The environmental damage may never fully heal. Was it worth it? Lesson 3. Once you make certain mistakes, they're almost impossible to fix. You can't just pick up a city and move it. You can't easily clean arsenic out of soil or remove decades of industrial pollution. The people of Magnitogorsk, Norilsk, and Vorkuta are living with mistakes made by planners 80 to 90 years ago. The future of these cities. What will happen to Magnitogorsk, Norilsk, and Vorkuta in the future? Magnitogorsk will probably continue existing as long as there's demand for steel and iron. The pollution might slowly improve if Russia enforces environmental regulations, but this seems unlikely. Norilsk faces an uncertain future with climate change melting the permafrost. More buildings will collapse. More environmental disasters will happen. But the mining will continue because the minerals are too valuable. Vorkuta is the most likely to be abandoned completely. When the last coal mine closes, there will be no reason for anyone to stay. It might become a true ghost town within our lifetimes, a monument to Soviet ambition and the cost of industrialization at any price. These three cities, Magnitogorsk, Norilsk, and Vorkuta, represent humanity's ability to endure almost anything. They also represent our capacity to make terrible decisions when we value money and power over human life. Thousands of people still live in these cities today. They wake up every morning, breathe polluted air, work hard jobs, and try to find happiness in seemingly hopeless situations. They are resilient and tough in ways most of us will never need to be. But their resilience doesn't make these cities acceptable. It doesn't justify the decisions that created them. These cities should serve as warnings, not blueprints. The next time someone suggests putting economic growth ahead of human welfare, or building in places humans aren't meant to live, or accepting pollution as the cost of progress, we should remember Magnitogorsk, Norilsk, and Vorkuta. We should remember what happens when we forget that cities are supposed to serve people, not the other way around. These Soviet cities may be the most depressing places on Earth, but they teach us an important lesson. The measure of a society isn't how much it produces, but how well it treats its people. These cities really exist, and people really live there. Their stories deserve to be told.